It is 18 years since US forces launched airstrikes against Afghanistan following the attacks of September the 11th. The Taliban was toppled within weeks, but the ensuing insurgent conflict has dragged on ever since and become the longest war in US history. Here with a look back at what happened and a look at future peace prospects is Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi from Deakin University. Niamatullah, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome. This 18th anniversary today means that every child in Afghanistan has known nothing but conflict. That's a somber milestone.
This is indeed a very, very long conflict, the brunt of which is experienced by the Afghans. In fact, for the Afghans, the war and violence have been multi-generational. I remember in 2002 and 3, a lot of older Afghans used to say that they had experienced a lot of hardship and violence, but there is an opportunity for a new generation of Afghans to experience life with peace and stability. But unfortunately, after 18 years, now we see that a lot of those hopes are also being dashed. There is a new generation of Afghans who are also growing up with war and instability.
So remind us about the beginning of the war and how it developed.
In general, the conflict in Afghanistan is much longer than 18 years. The conflict is started with the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and then there was multiple phases of the conflict of the 80s and 90s. But the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in October of 2011 began after Al-Qaeda launched 2001, September 2011 terrorist attack in the United States. As we know, Al-Qaeda was based in Afghanistan. Their leadership, Osama bin Laden, was based in Afghanistan. So the US started demanding the Taliban to hand over the leadership of Al-Qaeda for what they had done. But the Taliban refused to hand over. As a result, the US, in a coalition of states from around the world, launched a military invasion that toppled the Taliban regime in 2001.
So what difference did the death of Osama bin Laden make?
Well, his death in Pakistan by the US Navy forces, special forces, was a significant symbolic victory for the United States in terms of bringing and killing the top person responsible for Al-Qaeda leadership and his role in establishment of the network. But as we know, Al-Qaeda as a network has not disappeared since then. In fact, there are evidences that show the Taliban are still allowing elements of Al-Qaeda to operate and work with them closely in areas of Afghanistan where the Taliban are controlling those territories.
And a peace deal between the Taliban and the US was close until fairly recently. What are the prospects of that getting back on track?
Well, I think there is a very broad consensus, both in Afghanistan but also internationally, that there is no way out of the conflict in Afghanistan other than through a political settlement. There is also a lot of pressure in the United States that after 18 years the conflict must come to an end, and this was one of the pledges that President Trump made in his electoral campaign in 2016. But this conflict, as we know, is quite complicated. It involves multiple players in Afghanistan, regionally, countries involved in the conflict, but also internationally. Having said that, there is efforts going on at the moment to revive those talks, which were essentially killed by a series of tweets by President Trump in last month. There are efforts by both the U.S. officials. The U.S. Special Representative Zalmay Khalilzad for Afghan reconciliation has been in Pakistan recently, and there are some reports that there have been meetings between Taliban delegation that has also been visiting Islamabad at the same time.
And Niamatullah, we're still, of course, waiting for the final results of the recent presidential election. Is that likely to make a big difference to the country's future?
Well, I think if there is a big if here, if the election produces a legitimate and broadly acceptable government in Afghanistan, that can make a huge difference both for Afghan civilians, but also for a renewed peace talks with the Taliban. And I think the key outcome of a legitimate government election in Afghanistan would be a government that can negotiate with the Taliban from a position of strength. And if there is an agreement negotiated that can be seen as broadly legitimate by various groups in Afghanistan. But if the election go wrong, the elections results are contested, then the political crisis or the outcome of the election can also have huge negative implications for a peace deal with the Taliban.
So how optimistic are you about the country's future?
Well, I think it is very difficult, as the conflict in Afghanistan shows for the past 40 years almost now, to make any predictions. But I think over the past 18, 19 years, Afghanistan as a society has changed dramatically. A lot of those changes are probably the unintended consequence of the international intervention, by creating spaces for a new generation of Afghans to go to schools, to universities. And as a result, there is a new generation of Afghans who are leading social and cultural change in the country. And I think they bear the hopes for the future of the country. But at the same time, the politics and security situation of the country is remaining extremely fragile and depends on a lot of factors, including the future U.S. policies and approaches in Afghanistan.
Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi, thank you.
A pleasure.